It was definitely a fun one.
All right, it's all you.
Yeah, since then, I've seen a lot of other blind players coming out into the forefront too.
Well, all right, we're live. So, welcome to Wheel Life Problems, brought to you by Wheelchair Gamer.
Hey.
I'm Ricky. That's Glitched. That's Wheels. And today we have Brian. Welcome to the podcast, Brian.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you folks having me on today.
Oh,
Absolutely.
yeah, absolutely. So, you're on to help represent the disabled community, I guess you could say. But
Or
do you
accessible
mind telling us a little
community.
bit about yourself?
Sure. I obviously I enjoy video games. I'm actually a post AP biology science teacher in a college prep school. I actually studied molecular biology all the way up through grad school, as well as some musical composition in undergrad.
Oh, wow.
Uh, my spare time, I enjoy video games and dancing ballet. I get a little bit of ballroom in there too on occasion.
Wow.
Um, and recently got diagnosed with EDS after about 10 years of trying to figure out exactly what was going on. So, see, not quite as much dancing now as I was before as a result of that and, pandemic, but still figuring out exactly how everything works with that. Other things, a lot of my recent work has been in the fighting game community. There's been the fighting game community is a bit of a microcosm within gaming and even esports in general because of the amount of the information about the game that is present outside of the game itself. The huge portion of being a part of the FGC and learning fighting games in general is absorbing information digitally, right? Finding combo videos, finding tutorials, even just talking with people online, on Discord, on forums. And there are significant accessibility barriers to that. And a lot of them require people to think about access in a way that's different than just sort of regular social media content. And in some ways is closer to how it's thought of for the games themselves. And so a lot of the work that I've been doing in Access is just highlighting some of these issues and helping people figure out how to tackle them, which is certainly not, I don't know solutions to everything, but I've been meeting lots of people who've been in the space longer than I have and doing my best to learn what they've already established sort of as best practices and then keep on spreading those as best I can.
Sounds like you're a pretty busy dude.
Yeah.
I
So,
like I
you
like to
said
keep
you
my
have
plate.
I want to ask you more about the video game thing uh, later, but first I want to ask you about exactly what EDS is. I know it's Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and it affects your joint. What from I was reading up on it. It affects your joints, your skin,
Yeah, that's what I was hearing. Yeah.
um, what's it called, your connective tissues and stuff. So can you give me a
Yeah,
little more information about that?
sure. I will warn you though, you did just ask a biology teacher to explain something biology related, so brace
Which
yourself.
is perfect. I
Um,
love it. I love science.
Let's
I
get
plan on going
sciency.
to science myself. So lay it
so
on me.
EDS specifically is a genetic condition that affects a protein called collagen. So collagen is actually the most plentiful protein in your body. It makes up 90% of the protein in your body.
Really?
And it is mostly used to give things structure. So when you think about your ligaments or your tendons, the thing that helps keep those together is collagen. When you think about your skin, moving your skin around, the reason why your skin cannot move infinitely, collagen, keeping everything together.
It
Even
keeps
your teeth,
the elasticity of skin
yes,
is the collagen. Okay.
in
Okay.
part, yes. Keeping your teeth in their sockets, more ligaments, periodontal ligaments, again, heavily reliant on collagen. Even things like the way wrinkles form, very heavily dictated by collagen. So in EDS, and there are 14 different subtypes of collagen. In EDS, one or more of these subtypes is in some way messed up, relative to what we would think of in like your standard human who doesn't have any mutations in these genes. So sometimes it's the collagen itself,
Mhm.
where one of the collagen genes is mutated. Sometimes it's a protein that's involved in sort of getting collagen ready to do what it's supposed to do. Because collagen itself, when it's turned into a protein, it's not immediately ready to function. You actually take a whole bunch of collagen proteins, stick those together into a gigantic fiber outside of a cell, and then you attach that to something, and that's what's performing the actual sort of connective function. So sometimes it's the proteins that are involved with creating those larger structures that can be mutated and causing similar issues. But the bottom line is something that is based on collagen does not function as it would be expected. So you see some of the symptoms that people describe a lot are like the really stretchy skin, which I actually don't have, but also extreme flexibility in some joints, which came in handy when I was learning ballet, but also leads to increased wear and tear in those joints just because they're not as stable as you would normally expect. So I experience a lot more of what are called subluxations, which is a partial dislocation of a joint. I experience that pretty regularly. A lot of times, like I'll get woken up in my sleep because I'll be dreaming about dancing, and I'll I'll bend one of my knees a tiny bit too far, and my knee will pop partway out, and that'll wake me up. So when I'm playing games, I got to be really careful with my hands in particular. My fingers can pop part way out of joint relatively easily, and that's actually part of why I swapped over to fighting games. I'm sure we'll talk more about that later, so I'll leave that on the table for now. But the bottom line is, yeah, it's connective tissue, and because your joints are so reliant on connective tissue in the cartilage that's present, which is collagen based, in ligaments and tendons, which are also collagen based. There are a lot of different potential ways for one of the collagen genes or one of the proteins associated with helping collagen to work correctly to get mutated and cause a problem there. So overwhelmingly, when you talk to folks with EDS, even across multiple different subtypes, multiple types of collagen that are affected, skin-based symptoms and joint-based symptoms come up a lot.
So those are the most common?
Yeah, those tend to be the most common. And each of the subtypes shows up with different regularity. The type that's most common is just called hypermobile. And for that one, we actually don't know the specific gene that's mutated. All the other 13 subtypes the other 12 subtypes, we do know at least one of the genes that's mutated. And so the current thinking is that hypermobile is actually a bunch of other subtypes that all have really similar symptoms. We just haven't really parsed them out from each other yet.
Gotcha.
So that's sort of if it's clear from your symptoms that you have EDS, but we can't put you in one of the other buckets because the genetic sequencing happens and there's none of the genes are mutated. That's when you get put in the hypermobile category. So the sequencing actually isn't done for me. I don't know for sure what I have, but it seems likely I'm probably going to end up in hypermobile as well.
Gotcha. So it's kind of like a gray field right now, the way it seems like you're explaining it. I want to make sure I understand it right, and this is a paraphrase. It sounds like I'm going to use the analogy of concrete and rebar as like an analogy. Concrete without rebar is extremely brittle and break easily. It doesn't have as much flex or structural support. So it sounds like your joints it's like concrete without the rebar, because the rebar helps reinforce that concrete and give it a structure. Am I understanding that correctly?
You're definitely going in the right direction. I'd say more it's really bad rebar, right? It's got way too much aluminum in there in that alloy, so it doesn't do a good job of holding things in place.
Okay.
Now the hypermobile can what exactly? What's that characterization again? Like, what exactly does that mean? You're able to like? I'm sorry, I was just making sure I was understanding this.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It's movement of joints beyond what is normally expected within a given range of motion. So for me, for a very long period of time, I've been able to just sort of stand and come very close to palming the floor, even before I was dancing. My shoulders are also really flexible. Like I can, how people will like try and touch their hands behind their back. If I just go straight over and under, I'm touching in the middle of my palm, like not even warmed up or anything.
Wow.
I experience that a lot. Also, just like with general joint laxity. So if I'm walking up or down stairs, I have to actually consciously hold my shoulders tight, or I can feel my joints moving in and out slightly. Kind of like what people do. You know how some people will crack their fingers by pulling a finger like straight out, partway out of the joint? My shoulders do that when I'm going up and down stairs.
Okay, now I understand the hypermobile.
Gravity alone.
Hypermobile makes sense. Like I get the, maybe it explains. I don't know. It just makes sense now with the way that you're describing, like how you have to literally be so careful because the joints literally can move like they're mobile, like almost.
Yeah.
Yeah,
They're a little too mobile.
yeah, that's exactly the issue. That's why
Yeah.
all the subluxations happen. And I do want to mention for anyone
Yeah.
who's tuning in, who's thinking like, oh wow, I can touch my toes. Oh man, I can touch my thumb to my forearm, which is another one of the classic tests. There's still a good chance that you don't have EDS. A lot of people have hypermobility in one or more joints. That's completely normal. Don't immediately think that like anything that I describe with me is going to happen to you. Of course, if you're concerned, talk to a doctor. But some amount of hypermobility is expected for most people. So don't.
Yeah, I've seen it before where it's like, like, I mean, who didn't see a friend that was like, hey, look what I can do? And there was like some weird, like, thing they could overextend or pop out a joint.
Like, the
and
only
like,
one I used to be able to do is the thumb to the back of the arm thing, but I can't do it anymore. On either side.
Ricky's just like, nah.
Yeah, but even
Yeah,
so,
that
even
makes
that
cringe.
that amount of flexibility would be considered hypermobile. But again, that's pretty normal, right? As far as I know, Glitch doesn't have EDS, but it's still hypermobile in that joint, and that's
Okay.
perfectly normal.
Used to be. Not anymore.
Well, that amount of motion, even getting that close to your forearm, is still considered hypermobile.
Oh, okay, so that's still like, so people can still be able to do some of these things, but it doesn't necessarily qualify them to have, EDS.
Yeah, so the two may correlate, but there's no causation there.
Yeah.
Not necessarily.
Right. Okay.
Okay. So how do you go about treating something like that? Is there any treatment to the best of your knowledge?
So physical therapy in most cases helps to sort of stabilize joints. You strengthen the tendons and the ligaments that are there,
Okay.
and that adds back sort of some of the underlying tension and keeps joints in place. Um, Also, there are for specific symptoms, there are treatments that work for some people, um, but it's not something that's curable. It is something that is slowly expected to progress. In most of the subtypes, this is not something that has a significant impact on life expectancy or anything. It's just like your joints get crappier as you get older, and there's also a lot of other chronic pain that tends to be associated with it because so much of your body relies on collagen. So even if the joints are like the most obvious thing, my first symptom was not joint related. The first thing that really made me realize I had something going on, it was nerve pain related. So I've been dealing with a lot of nerve pain that nothing has really helped for about the past decade, and that's one of the symptoms that I get to deal with.
Really?
Everyone with EDS, so because everyone's genetic background is different, even if people have the same mutation in a given gene, everything else that's going on with their connective tissue could be slightly different. And so as a result, the same mutation, while it may have similar symptoms in two patients, ultimately they may experience it in a different fashion.
Yep. It's one of the interesting miracles of medicine. And it happens a lot in a lot of different conditions, just like optic nerve hypoplasia.
No, is
which
this
mine.
something you're born with, or and like is it carried by like the mother or father? Like how does that all work?
Yeah, it is a genetic disease.
Okay.
As far as we know. So right there's the other subtypes. We've found specific genes that are mutated for each one. Hypermobile, it's thought that they exist. We just don't know exactly what they are yet.
Gotcha.
But there actually isn't a history of it in my family. I'm the first person that's really had significant symptoms. So like there are theories that it may have come from one of my parents in particular, but especially if I end up having one of the subtypes where we know that there's a genetic
Yeah.
mutation, then yeah, we can get my parents tested and figure out for sure. But up until this
Be the
point,
recessive gene? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but like I'm wondering if like it could be part ancestry or it could have been a recessive gene, and maybe your grandparents or great grandparents could have had it and just not known it, and then you're the lucky one, for lack of a better term, that got it.
so different subtypes are dominant or recessive. The more common ones, including hypermobile and classical, tend to present as dominant. However, because symptoms can vary so much from person to person, it's not unusual for it to seem like it's skipping a generation. Especially in men, actually, overwhelmingly, women tend to get diagnosed with EDS at a higher rate.
Really?
And there are different theories out there for why that is. I've heard some folks say that it's just because men physically tend to be larger, and so they're because they physically have more connective tissue. If there is something that's a little bit messed up with it, it doesn't impact their lives to the same extent. So specifically for the more mild cases of EDS, it might make sense that you're not seeing it as much in people that have larger amounts of connective tissue, to sort of keep things in place. And some of that sort of goes in line with women in general tending to be slightly more flexible than men. It's going along similar thought processes there. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's a genetic disorder, right? If I were to have kids someday, it is something that would be something that we would look out for in those kids, right?
Right.
And
Okay.
I know I must have gotten it from one of my parents. We just don't know which one.
Right. Okay. So they definitely have seen EDSs across families. Like there are families that have had like a son that may have had it, but there may have been a father that had it. That sort of thing.
And it actually goes even further back than modern medicine.
Okay.
So, I mean, it was first described by, I think it was a Danish pharmacist and a doctor that was Ehlers-Danlos, who identified it in families. But you actually find the first reference of it by Hippocrates in 500 BC in some of his records of treating people at battles, where he noticed that a family of related warriors from the same place in Greece all had these really flexible joints. Their scars looked weird. Their skin was super soft, and it's exactly Ehlers-Danlos. Like it's classic Ehlers-Danlos symptoms described at 500 BC, and it's consistent, right? It's
wow.
within a specific family.
So
So that's generally
scars
considered.
can scars be affected because of the collagen in skin and like that can like you know and the skin being softer, I guess, more pliable.
Yeah, so it's called atrophic scarring, and it leads to
Hmm.
scars that look a bit different than you might expect. In
Hmm.
some cases, it's not super obvious, but when you squish the scar, it will look super wrinkly. So unfortunately, I don't have an easy one that I can like put on camera here and show you. There's one on my ankle that's really obvious, um,
Okay.
but yeah, it is scarring is in many cases affected.
Gotcha.
Hmm.
And
Interesting.
I noticed you're wearing gloves. Does that have to do with anything with it?
Yeah, they're regular compression gloves, so they, especially at the end of the day when my hands are tired, they help stabilize my joints a little bit.
Ah.
Um, that's
All right.
that's about it.
Gotcha. That's what I was curious about, and just kind
Hmm.
of clarifying on it. You keep mentioning the subtypes, and I was trying to read up on about the subtypes, but I was wondering if you could clarify, like, how is if you could explain, like, I'm five, the differences in subtypes. Um,
So I literally have done a lecture and a half on all the different subtypes. So I'm not going to give you, the full hour and a half long version here.
Well, do you have the
But
TED talk that we can go to? Like,
so so the bottom line here is that anything that is affecting the collagen in your connective tissue is theoretically another subtype of Ehlers-Danlos, right? So
okay.
all of these subtypes just relate to different collagen or collagen-associated proteins being mutated. And because these collagen subtypes don't all appear in the same tissues, you get different symptoms out.
Hmm.
So, for instance, type 1 collagen is what you find in your ligaments and tendons overwhelmingly. I mean, there's some other subtypes in there too. But on the other hand, types 3, 5, and 7 are what tend to line your nerves. Um, at the same time, there are even other ones that are involved in things like the development of your retinas and your eyes. So a lot of these other subtypes are affecting very specific portions of your body where that type of collagen is particularly plentiful. And so you will see things like cornea is not forming correctly in kids' eyes for some of the subtypes. You see issues with motor development in others, just because of the specific type of collagen that's affected and
Right.
where that comes into play in the body.
Hmm.
Gotcha. So it sounds like
Um,
to me like there's just an almost quote unquote endless type of subtypes when
yeah.
it comes to the EDS, or
So there
I,
are very specific defined subtypes that exist. on the basis of certain genetic mutations, and then everything else is right now considered hypermobile, basically.
Right. So
I will note.
that's a lot.
I will note that I have met
Wow.
a couple of people with a blindness affecting EDS.
I was wondering about that. If either one of you had met anybody that had that, or if I've played with anybody that actually had that issue. I didn't know. Maybe I did.
Most of the subtypes are not particularly common.
Okay.
If I'm remembering correctly, classic, hypermobile, and classic-like, which has very similar symptoms, but a slightly different method of treatment and a different mutation associated with it. Those three make up the vast majority of EDS cases that you see.
Mm-hmm. The a blindness affecting one is very, very uncommon, and I think throughout all of my years of dealing with other blind or low vision individuals, I've only met one person who had it.
Wow. Yeah. So, yeah, it's interesting because I can kind of even though I have muscular dystrophy has so many different like types too. So it's kind of like having a neuromuscular disease, I kind of realize like there's such a crazy spectrum because there'll be things that you can have that are part of like one of the types that may not be what you have.
Mm-hmm.
So there's like some low overlap. So
So you mentioned that you were diagnosed only just within a few years. Can you like talk me through what that was like? Was it like a sense of relief when you were diagnosed, or was it kind of like did it kind of scratch at your biology sense of you and be like, ooh, something more to learn about? Can you talk me through that?
So I'd say probably like the past 2.5 months have been particularly interesting as far as my diagnosis goes. It does go back a little bit further than that. When I was last year is when I really started diving into accessibility a bit more, and I was noticing that one absolutely fantastic mind in accessibility, Cherry Thompson, their
Absolutely.
symptoms and the way that they were dealing with some of the issues that were coming up as they were playing different games were really similar to some of the stuff that I was experiencing with my hands. And up until that point, everything had been assumed to be neurological. So that was like the first point where I was like, oh, hey, maybe I should, look at something that's outside just straight neurology. But my neurological symptoms were still so severe that it was like, okay, well, it's probably still just like the intersection of nerves, and maybe there's something going on with connective tissue, but it's probably mostly still nerves. And that's sort of what the doctors were thinking too. And so we tried some more tests there, and like didn't really come up with anything that was useful. But then again, I became very close friends with someone else with EDS, Aiden Strahoon, and they also work in accessibility. They're a part of Can I Play That and all that jazz. And so they and I have been very good friends, and we were mentioning symptoms to each other and kept on making jokes that like, oh wow, we're twins. And after like a month and a half of making these jokes, they were like, wait, are you sure you don't actually have EDS? I was just like, well, I've never actually like talked about it with my doctors. And so I looked further into the symptoms, and it was like, oh wow, like all of these hypermobile things that they're describing, like that is all stuff that applies to me. So I talked to the neuromuscular specialist I was seeing at the time, and he sent me to get an appointment with someone else. And I'm very lucky in that I live in New York City. And it just so happens that there are a number of different hospitals here that can do the diagnosis, which is not super common. A lot of times it's done by a medical geneticist, and that's a subspecialty that can be very difficult to find. In my case, it was actually Columbia University. One of the hospitals associated with them has an excellent clinical genetics team, and so I saw a doctor there who literally like went in, took a history, looked at all the tests that had been run, saw the notes from my other doctors, did the hypermobility tests, and I was just like, yeah, you've definitely got some type of EDS. And they're still figuring out exactly what's going on. There's clearly some more stuff going on beyond just like normal hypermobile symptoms. So we're still waiting to see the results of some tests on that. But it was nice to finally have a meaningful path towards some type of treatment. Up until this point, basically everything that's been tried has not really had an effect. And when you look at folks that have experienced hypermobile EDS in a way that is vaguely similar to me, in particular with having what's called dystonia in some of their muscles, where portions of the muscle doesn't really seem to relax correctly, which I get a lot in my forearms, especially when my hands are feeling weaker. And so seeing that and being like, okay, well, there are, some medicines that these folks have tried, and knowing also like, hey, this is something that physical therapy is probably going to slow down for you, right? That's going to help with your quality of life to some extent, and also like start wearing knee braces right now. I'm actually wearing them right now as I talk with you folks. So finally having something that was like, okay, here are things that are likely to actually make an impact was really, really relieving. Living with sort of that unknown for the past decade has been very rough because I had to take an exit master's after 6 years in a PhD program, which sucked. And I've held positions in industry that I could not type physically for long enough during a day to keep the position. And so have had to move on to different career paths as a result. And up until that point, it was just like, we don't know why. We have no explanation why, and a lot of the symptoms are still unexplained. EDS explains a lot of the joint stuff and the hypermobility, but I still deal with really significant peripheral neuropathy, small fiber neuropathy in particular. So that if someone just like touches my arm, it hurts. And
hypersensitivity.
Yeah. And so like we know what's causing it, but we don't know why those nerves are dying. And so the hope is that finally, like with EDS as a starting point, not just the EDS symptoms, but some of the other stuff that's going on as well, we'll be able to put in better context and hopefully be able to address.
You said the symptoms started showing up 10 years ago, you said?
So that's when they got really serious. Now in retrospect, I can look back to my childhood and see like, oh yeah,
there were signs here and there.
Yeah, like, I was playing soccer all the time as a kid, and I would always like, from falls that wouldn't hurt other kids, like my knees would hurt or my ankles would hurt. And I complained about it, and my dad just thought that I was just like whining and didn't want to play more soccer. But now in retrospect, it's like, no, Dad, like, no, I was telling the truth. That really hurt.
Yeah.
And there's a time when I was taking swimming lessons when I slipped and just fell into a split at about the age of 14. Just on the pool deck randomly. Never had done a split in my life up till that point. Never tried or worked on my flexibility. Just sort of happened.
And it didn't hurt or anything?
No, my hip felt weird, which now I know, like, yeah, my hip probably popped part way out.
Oh, goodness.
But yeah, it's in retrospect, there were things earlier, but really the first symptoms were my junior and senior years of undergrad. I was running the fencing club as well as dancing ballet, and I was running into issues where I was getting disarmed a bunch. And my hand strength, like I didn't realize it at the time. I honestly thought that the other people were just being really aggressive. And so I was really focusing on like, no, like don't break the weapons, please. We can't afford replacements. But really, in retrospect, what was happening is just my grip was starting to get really weak. And similarly with ballet, like all of a sudden I couldn't do finger turns because it was hurting my joints a ton, which is a type of turn where you're providing sort of a pivot for your partner by holding one or two fingers above their head, which they hold onto with like an open hand as they're doing a type of turn underneath you. And it does apply a little bit of force to your knuckles, and you're supposed to like provide a counterbalance and guide them along and provide some more force there. And it hurt my hand like crazy, and we had no idea why. When I got to grad school, it escalated to like, oh wow, after about a year and a half, I could not do bench work anymore. I could not do the pipetting. And so that was when it was like, okay, there's something that's really wrong here. So that was a little bit under a decade ago was when that happened.
So I understand that ballet seems to be like a passion of yours. Is it devastating to you now that like you can't dance as well as you used to, or how do you feel that hole of like not being able to ballet as well as you could?
Definitely hurts. There's no way around that really. There are other things that I've lost completely. I used to be a reasonably talented pianist, and I can't play piano at all anymore. Rachmaninoff, Prelude in C# minor, The Bells of Moscow, favorite piece to play. Would not make it through even the slower portions of the beginning now. Like my fingers just don't hold up. As far as ballet goes, I can still do some stuff. I still, in fact, on my Discord, I teach what's called a mini bar, which is a miniature version of the warm-ups that people do like leading into the more intense part of ballet class. So I teach that about once every week or two in my Discord for whoever's interested. I still have a decent amount of mobility and ability to move. There are just certain parts of the dancing that are a bad idea. Like for me, doing grand pliés, which is sort of like a really carefully controlled deep squat. That's a really bad idea for my knees now. So I've got to be careful of those.
Pop out, or your hip might pop out, or something.
My knees could pop out if I'm not careful. And along similar lines, I was really good at partnering. Like that was my jam. And so there are certain steps in partnering that I can't really do anymore, like the finger turns, like certain lifts, depending on like how well my partner jumps and how much force I have to provide myself versus just guiding the amount of lift that they're providing. There are certain poses that would not be safe for me to do. Depending on the day and how much force I have in my hands, there are again, some lifts that just wouldn't be safe. But even with stuff like that, a lot of times you can build spotting into the choreography in some fashion. And in theory, I could still perform a decent amount of it. I just, I would not be hitting, the double tour in the air. I have to be really careful with my jumps and my landings. And even just the amount of time I'm spending up on releve, which is sort of balanced up on your toes, not fully up, but on like tiptoe sort of. That can be really stressful for my joints with any sideways stress, which is inherent in all the turns that you do. So it's not that I can't dance ballet anymore. I just have to be careful about it and be smart about it. And it's something that I really want to hold on to. Because of the pandemic, I haven't been able to see a physical therapist yet, but the doctors that I'm working with are specifically setting me up with a therapist with a background in ballet, so that a lot of the therapeutic work that I'm doing to keep my muscles strong will specifically be based around allowing me to continue dancing as long as possible. That makes sense.
Yeah. That's actually great.
That is awesome.
That is really awesome.
I can definitely relate to the whole piano part because I'm a quadriplegic. I broke my neck when I was 18, and I used to play guitar, and also I was a BMXer. But the piano part I can relate to because I used to love playing guitar, and now my fingers, they just look like this, and I can't play anymore. It's devastating when you can't produce music anymore because music is such a universal language, and
yeah, I can kind of actually relate to this situation too because, for instance, I like playing guitar. I'll never be able to be a lead guitarist. It'll never happen. I mean, maybe in certain circumstances, but I could never do like metal solos. If I wanted to do that, like it's not happening. I can never do the speed. I'll never have that speed.
Man.
But I'm okay with the fact that I'm a decent rhythm guitarist. I can stay on the tune, and I can enjoy myself. So I take it for what it is. I still get to play. I just can't be I don't get to be the star, but that's okay.
So I've got a good music story for you guys then. So my last name is Petty, and my dad's name is actually Tom. And he's a talented guitarist. Like he can play guitar and piano quite well.
That's even better. That makes it even better.
So the entire time growing up, like the joke was, Tom Petty, and then me and my siblings were the Heartbreakers, right? But the other aspect of this is, so I actually sing as well. I've got a decent amount of classical training as a tenor, but my dad is like a mid to low range baritone.
Really?
And so when my dad tries to sing Tom Petty songs, it doesn't work so well because there's Free Falling. That's an A4, and my dad, like, maybe if someone kicked him really hard between the legs, he could hit it. But apart from that, like, it's just not happening. But for me, like, that's a walk in the park. So the ongoing joke in my family has been that I can sing Tom Petty better than Tom Petty can.
That's pretty good. That's pretty good.
That is great.
Oh my god, that's funny.
So you mentioned that you're a biology teacher. Did being a biology teacher kind of help you with coping with the fact that you had EDS?
I'm not sure about coping. Honestly, to some extent, it has added more stress. So a lot of my symptoms, when we talk about disability, a lot of times we talk about the visibility of a disability. And for a lot of folks with EDS, it's relatively straightforward to hide. If your symptoms aren't too severe, maybe you have to wear knee braces, but your walking isn't affected too much. And so if you were in a position to teach, it wouldn't necessarily be something that's incredibly obvious to your students. And some of the emotional labor that is avoided with that is you don't have to answer questions about it, or you don't have people asking questions, even if you're not obligated to answer them. So for me, I get pretty significant fasciculations, which is movements of connective tissue. And a lot of times they're on my face. So my kids have seen my face twitching like crazy. They also know that I sometimes struggle to pick things up because of the weakness in my hands. And back in October, when we were still in like the hybrid system briefly, some of them saw that I on some days I can't really walk super well. Depending on how stressed my joints have been recently and whether there's been a recent change in the weather. So in my case, it was, teaching and being in front of some occasionally very judgmental students every day has been difficult at times because there are a lot of questions that the students have. And what I teach
high school as well too, right?
Yeah, I mostly teach seniors, and I actually teach them anatomy and physiology. So leading up to my diagnosis, we were covering connective tissue, and the example that was used as what happens when things go wrong was Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So it very quickly went from like something that like we talked about as like, general introduction to disability, where there's some amount of emotional labor involved with me explaining like, disability is not a word, and why we say disabled, and generally it's thought of as good to avoid euphemisms, because disability is not an insult, right? It is a symptom of a system that does not take into account all of the different ways in which bodies exist. And so teaching them the social model was a big part of sort of introducing myself. But what I didn't necessarily anticipate was teaching EDS and then getting the diagnosis a month later, and then being like, oh yeah, so all this stuff that we talked about, let's talk about it with respect to my symptoms, which was a great teaching tool because I got to walk them through like all the different subtypes of collagen and which ones might be affecting my specific symptoms, but at the same time was just so exhausting because I'm talking about all this random crap that's really painful and frustrating to deal with for like 3 classes straight. So it definitely benefited my students. They're going to have a much better understanding of disability and collagen in particular when they get to undergrad. But, don't get me wrong, I absolutely love my students. It's a pleasure to teach them every day, but it was exhausting. It was not a sense of relief. And I'm glad that I did it. I'm going to do it again next year and the year after that and the year after that, but it is exhausting.
I can imagine. I know the $1 million question is how'd they all do on the test? Because if any of them failed,
so funny you should mention that. So their midterm was actually due today at midnight. So we'll see how they do. There are a lot of questions about connective tissue on there. I'm pretty sure most of them are going to do pretty well. They're a smart bunch.
That's good. If they fail, then you need new students. No.
But honestly, like I hope they don't, because if they do, that just means more work for me tutoring them, getting them caught up.
Yeah, that too.
So this is AP, right?
So some of these students have taken AP biology, some of them have not, but it is very much college introductory biology is what I teach.
Okay.
Well, so we talked about the whole we talked about all the whole science side of this, but now you also mentioned that you're really big into the accessible gaming aspect in your life too. And I was wondering, were you already involved in accessibility gaming before you were diagnosed, or was that a product of your diagnosis?
I mean, I was officially diagnosed 2 weeks ago, so yes, I was definitely involved before the official diagnosis.
Okay.
But if you go back to pre-symptoms, no, I wasn't. I very, very much only absorbed video games casually up all the way through undergrad when some of the symptoms were first starting to show. So it wasn't something that I had, like, I was vaguely aware of like colorblind modes and things like that. But I would say the first time I really started thinking about it was, and actually this is one of the earlier symptoms we've identified, was my sophomore year of undergrad. I struggled to push in thumbsticks. On was it? I don't even remember. I think Xbox 360 was out by then. But I couldn't push in the stick to in I think it was like Call of Duty to zoom in. Right? Is the R3 was not something that I could do. So that was, I think, the
Really?
first time that it really made sense to me, like why you
Huh.
would need extensive button remapping options.
Yeah.
But as far as like really diving into the access side of things, that's probably been about the past 2 years.
So what got you involved in the accessibility community then? Like initially, if it had nothing to do with your diagnoses other than just, or was it that weakness in not being able to hit the R3 that kind of like hit the trigger of like, hey, maybe someone else is having trouble with this too. I should get into this community.
Oh no,
And
that
like,
was that was way back in the day. That was back in undergrad. That was a decade ago. 2 years ago, I think it was just on Twitter. I had tweeted something about being frustrated, and somebody introduced me to Can I Play That, and it went from there. As soon as I started thinking about it more, with my background in biology in particular, it immediately made sense to me why these barriers would exist, and that there would be different strategies for tackling them. And basically, I'm someone who plays games very much for socialization, right? I don't play things solo too much. Um, a lot of times, it's fighting games with buddies. It's Destiny 2 with a group of people. It's PlanetSide 2 in particular. Friday and Sunday
Yeah,
nights with
you love that game.
the whole gang of the first Terran Rangers. And so for me, as soon as I dove into the access side of things, one of the first things I did was find other disabled players to play with. And so by default, I learned about the barriers that they were facing. And for me, like I want to be able to play games with my friends. So if people are making games that I want to play but can't play with my friends, that's a problem for me as much as it's a problem for my friend. So uh,
point.
I just sort of from that I learned as much as I could about some of these different barriers and how to tackle them and have just honestly I'm a lot of people in the space have been there for a while and have a decent amount of expertise, and I don't think I really fall into that category yet. I know a decent amount about like my specific presentation of EDS, and I know a lot about people that have very close presentations where I can suggest things like, hey, like pick up Yakuza and learn to play it on a fight stick because it is way easier on your hands. Same thing, actually, the entirety of the Final Fantasy VII remake can be played on a fight stick, and it is so much easier for me to do it that way than on a controller. I pretty much can't use controllers because now even the face buttons are too much stress on my thumbs. And
That's
so
interesting to think about. Like all these different games that could be played on a fight stick, and nobody's thought to do it.
Yeah, well, it's just like how I remember on Twitch one time I saw this chick playing. I guess yeah, she was playing with a DDR dance pad, and she was destroying Dark Souls. Like she was absolutely killing this game, and was playing it better than I've seen people use a controller. And I was just amazed by this. But same thing,
And
like yeah, I mean, it's crazy. I don't know.
It's interesting, and I think this is actually an interesting topic to discuss is alternative controllers for people with disabilities, because the fight stick for Yakuza or chick with the dance pad on Dark Souls, I wonder how many people who have hand pains but can walk perfectly well and don't have any leg problems in their lower body could learn to destroy Dark Souls with a DDR pad.
Yeah, or yeah.
For a while, I actually played The Division on DDR pad and controller at the same time.
Really?
So there are certain games, and Ubisoft has historically been pretty good at this. Recently, EA games have also allowed it, where you can combine inputs from keyboard and mouse and multiple controllers simultaneously, and it doesn't in a lot of games it'll like stutter while it switches from using one controller to the next.
Right.
But those don't at all. So for Division, I was moving around using the inputs on the DDR pad, and then basically had the heel of my thumb palmed stuck against the right stick on a controller, and was using that to aim pinned to my thigh while I was standing up, and like I was able to aim and shoot with the right bumper for aim and right trigger for shoot. But all the movement and getting in and out of cover and like picking up stuff was all done on the DDR pad. And that was sort of like the first bit of mixed controller that I did. And that was probably back, I don't know, 2014, 2015. It was shortly after the Division came out initially. But my current setups for games heavily rely on similar approaches. So I've got a Zach, which is wonderful. I just about everything that I play that's PC based, I've got foot switches that I use. So for instance, when I'm playing PlanetSide, my auto run toggle, my push to talk button, and my redeploy key are all foot switches. So it's three things
Wow,
that
that's cool.
they're not like urgent button presses, so it's not an issue from a competitive standpoint for me to have them on a muscle that's a bit slower. But it takes so much stress off of my fingers on my mouse. And I actually, when I'm playing that game, I still do use a mouse, and then I move with a fight stick. I don't move with a keyboard.
Okay.
So it is very much a mixed set of inputs that I'm using, where it's a mouse, foot pedals, a few actually sort of accessory buttons for fingers that are easier to press than keys, or that I can press with my whole hand on my desk, and then my fight stick in my lap, and the 8 buttons on the fight stick there also assigned to different things. So
battle station as opposed to cockpit as opposed to a controller when it comes to games.
Yeah, he's got the it's like he's got the Steel Battalion controller. Have you ever seen that before? That thing is insane. Yeah, that thing's insane. It's like you have to get a license to be able to use that thing.
Every time I get the chance to talk with you guys, it always makes me think of something new that I want to do and mess with. And here lately, I've been kind of off and on playing through the Cobra Kai game, the Karate Kid Saga Continues, whatever that just released like last month.
What? There's a Cobra Kai game? What?
Yes, there is.
I am buying this. I am playing this.
Yeah. So I've been messing around with it every now and then, and I've been using my controller like a little pleb, and I'm like, yo, wait, what if I broke out my fight stick and played this with that? Let's see how that goes. And
right, yeah.
So a lot of beat 'em up and Metroidvania games can be played effectively on fight sticks to the extent that some people speed run them on fighting game controllers. A good example of that would be the Blacktastic, who current multiple world record holder for some of the Ritual of the Night games. So it's Bloodstained, Ritual of the Night,
right,
and
yeah.
I forget. There's like all those different Bloodstained games. So he got a few of those and some Castlevania ones as well.
That's cool.
And a number of those runs he actually does on hitbox because the cleanliness of the inputs lets him hit a lot of what he needs to with much more consistency than just using a controller.
Gotcha.
I still want to try either a hitbox or the mix box with the actual keyboard arrow keys that I showed off last year.
Hades works great,
but
with
I just don't have the money for it.
Hades works really great with a fight stick because I have like a
really
you've
done it.
Yeah,
I should do it too now.
Because what I did was I actually stressed my hands out. Like I like did something where I almost had like a carpal tunnel like symptom, to where I had pressed buttons so hard, and I was like, well, how can I play this without stressing myself out? The fight stick actually makes it less stressful. So there you go.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly why I use one so much, especially for my left hand. For PC games, pressing individual keys or holding them with any amount of like repetitive button pressing is very stressful on my hands. So moving all of the requirement for movement in like a first person shooter from individual fingers being stressed to larger muscles in my arm has been a massive quality of life increase.
Oh, I can imagine. So, you mentioned a little bit ago about identifying barriers and tackling them. Do you have any examples of any barriers you've identified in the accessibility community that you've tackled, not just for yourself but for others?
I mean, I'm going to be honest here. Just about everything I've done has been learning a concept from someone else and then just applying it in a new place. So I don't think it's accurate to say that I've done anything particularly groundbreaking, except maybe being a bit more persistent on Twitter about reminding people to add alt text. A lot of the work that I've done has not been okay. I'm programming this new thing that breaks a barrier. It's just been taking what is already there and what works, and frankly what a lot of other people have been talking about for a long time and just couldn't get attention, and using the fact that I am a well-spoken white dude who has some amount of built-up social capital within the community to get people to listen. I mean, you look at things like auto captions on streams. As far as fighting games go, Deaf Gamers TV has been talking about it for, I think, like 2.5 years. Like before, at least 2.5 years before I was in the community, he was talking about it, and talking about it regularly. Right? Not that's something that lots of folks who are deaf or hard of hearing express frequently. Right? If you're running a stream and you want to make it an inclusive place for someone who's deaf, it's got to have some amount of captioning technology involved. Of course, ideally live captions, but that's not feasible for a lot of people, unfortunately. So, you kind of have to go the auto caption route. But the big push to actually get them added in the fighting game community, like the first stream that did it regularly, was the online local. That was back in March. And that was something, where I actually had talked with Chris about it. I saw him tweeting about it, and I was like, oh, hey, like, I know I can run this on my stream. I should actually just talk to tournaments about doing it on theirs, because it sucks that my buddy Chris, who loves fighting games, can't tune into the same commentary that I can because someone hasn't installed an extension yet. And so that's been, and I'm sorry, I realized that there was also a struggle to get them up and running on the stream, and I don't mean for that to be like, I know that
no.
But yeah, it was, and it's something that's come up a few times, and we've seen a few more people in fighting games move toward that, and there have been a lot more discussions happening. But again, it's not that I'm saying anything that's new or different. It's just someone else saying it. And so
I'm also happy you were able to start making the real push into the Capcom Pro Tour thing to get them to actually use stereo audio for their stream.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to have sort of a friend of a friend who is in close contact. They work directly for Capcom, and so I was put in touch as a reliable source. And that person has since then continued to advocate internally. I know that a lot of the work that they do is very much thankless because a lot of what they're asking for doesn't get implemented. And a lot of people internally see it as like, oh, this is a waste of our time. And a lot of people externally who are asking for these things see it as, oh, well, it didn't get implemented. They must not have tried hard enough. And I know that's definitely not the case. And my heart really goes out to them because I know how much work they're putting in. I hear about it from other people.
Yeah. It is any sort of disability advocacy position in any sort of company is a thankless job, because you've got a bunch of us out here that are pushing for these things to happen, who all we have to talk to is just one or two people, and the companies just look at these one or two people that they hired for this purpose as essentially fall guys to take the heat from the community so that they don't actually have to do anything.
Right.
And I want to be clear, this isn't a part of that person's job description. They are not an accessibility consultant for Capcom or anything like that. They're just someone who loves the community and heard about some of the struggles and has done their best to advocate internally. And it's such a shame because you see missed opportunities from companies on occasion where, for instance, there was a company that shall remain nameless that created like a short feature on a blind player, and when they tweeted it out, the image that was advertising it had no alt text. And you see things like that, and it's just like, well, how much did you learn from this experience? Something was lost along the way.
Would that happen to be a certain blind player that I might know and may have been linked with that video in some way, shape, or form?
I honestly don't know, but I would be surprised if it had only happened one time.
The industry seems to be pretty rough from what I hear, just in video games,
The upside is, especially in fighting games, and this is something that we've seen in the past year. Within the past year, NRS now has good alt text on a lot of their images. Capcom is increasingly using it. You see esports teams like Beast Coast, who, up until the recent hire, who, as I understand it, things have gotten back on track with their social media, alt text on everything, and pretty good alt text from what I've heard as well. To the extent that a number of folks that I know who do rely on screen readers have started rooting for Beast Coast just because their content is so much more consistently accessible than other teams. They don't have a particular attachment to the fighting game players or to South American Dota, It's just that was where they could actually absorb content. So
Ah,
that's who they were going to root for.
right.
And so there are absolutely stories like that that I think we're going to continue hearing, at least within fighting games, because it's something that's actively being discussed. Every week, I've got someone else who wants a hand getting captions up and running, or I've got someone else who has questions about alt text. I had the pleasure of working with Quasimodox to come up with the R-Mika-based alt text tutorial a few weeks ago that was really well received. So it is something that is increasingly being talked about,
Yeah.
which on the one hand, I'm really, really happy that it is, because we're finally starting to see more shifts at the community level, in order to include folks like Chris, folks like Super Blind Man, folks like Tekimeki Emily, who have all been talking about these issues for a long period of time. But at the same time, it's very frustrating for me to see, like, this didn't happen until there was someone with a less visible disability who was talking about it. And in many cases, someone who was a well-spoken white dude with a graduate degree, as opposed to someone who was not a white dude. And it's like, okay, I'm glad it's happening, but please just listen to the people that are talking about it
Right.
in the first place. Like, why make me irrelevant, please?
Yeah. Real quickly though, I wanted. Do you think you could, just in case nobody knows what alt text is, do you think you could give like a brief explanation as to why that's important and
I could do that. I'm sorry, I could do that because it's important to people with limited vision.
Okay, then shoot.
Alt text or alternative text descriptions, if you want the long, complicated format of the term, is essentially a text format that describes any sort of picture or imagery that you would want to display on a web page. It's important because screen readers don't read pictures;
Right.
they read text.
Right. I know what it is, but it's more for if someone comes back and listens,
Yeah.
watches this, is like, oh, that's what they're talking about. Just to make sure.
And so for folks who are watching, when you're posting an image on Twitter, when you've got it all lined up, if you're on mobile, there's a black button in the lower right-hand corner that says Alt with a plus on it. You press on that to pull up the panel to write your description. Or if you're on the desktop web page, underneath the image, you will see a line that says Add Description. You click on that and type your alt text in there, and you're good to go.
Yeah, I try to do it.
Please use it.
I tried to make a habit of it. I have not always done the best job at it, but it's something that I try to consciously do.
Just, and
yeah,
one thing with that we run into with the FGC, so tons of content in the FGC and the way that people learn is just Discord servers where you ask the experts and they tell you what's going on. And with alt text, there is no alt text function in Discord. So as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, Glitched, if you post an image in Discord and someone reads it with a screen reader, the screen reader will try to read the entire server address where that image is stored, which comes out to a very long string of numbers and letters.
Yes, indeed.
So make sure if you're posting in Discord, include a description after you post the image, because it is not great.
Or oftentimes it whenever you first pressed Control V to paste in an image or drag one over or do whatever it is, however you decide to paste your image into your message box, it will give you an option to add text to that image, like above that image with the same posting. Please add your alt text there. Either during that posting, initial posting, or afterwards. It just makes life so much easier for us if we can actually know what the picture is.
So a lot of these concepts are the types of things that I'm talking about when I mention the community-based work that I do, where we already know the solution. It's just there's so many people that don't know to do it, and normalizing it within fighting games specifically has been sort of the basis for the work that I'm putting in. And so to that end, recently there was a guide that was published by Can I Play That, which was a combined effort between me and Broly Legs, Tekimeki Emily, Deaf Gamers TV, and Super Blind Man. We gotten together for a chat, actually on the Online Locals channel, talking about these barriers that we faced in the digital world. And so I sort of put together all of their ideas into this guide so that folks could reference it and read like, oh, okay, here's this barrier and here's how you fix it. And along with that, there's been increased interest from folks who are doing things like trying to create codes of conduct and sort of set expectations within communities, and who are actively looking to include accessibility as an expectation, where if you are not doing these things that we know allow for inclusion of disabled people, you are being discriminatory, and that is against the code of conduct for some of these subcommunities. So that's been really exciting for me to see, right? Because up till this point, like, do you folks know of anywhere else in video games where if someone like outside of the accessibility community, maybe where if someone like refused to put captions on their video, they would be told that they were, completely out of line and moving against the code of conduct for a community, like a big public community? That's so cool.
Yeah, saying that they're not compliant. Like, I think that's something like 4 years ago, I knew, like, I was in a wheelchair and I knew nothing about like this whole accessible video game thing. I didn't was the last thing that I would even think about. I was like, oh, I like to play video games. It's my thing, whatever, But now I don't think that way.
To be honest, I'm torn on that, because on one hand, I'm sitting here thinking, as a disabled person, yo, this is great. Now I have content that's accessible to me. But as a lover of freedoms and people, being able to freely make the content in the way that they see fit to do so, it's like that part of me is like, no, this is draconian. Why do I have to do this when it doesn't affect me? And that conflict inside my head, it's going to receive some pushback from somewhere. Regardless, though, I'm happy to see it.
The way it's generally viewed is if you are creating a community and the intent, a big part of the intent of the community is to be specifically inclusive.
Yeah.
That things that are a part of that community should also make that effort to include. Right. Mm-hmm. So, and this goes along with like anything along the lines of, say, rampantly bigoted speech. Right. There are things that you just generally should not say for any number of different reasons. They would be incredibly insulting to any number of historically marginalized groups. Right. And so this is starting to view access through a related lens, where if you are not conscious of these issues that affect the community and working to mitigate them in the way that you are creating your content, you are effectively discriminating against that group. Now, keep in mind, these communities, you can still play fighting games or whatever without listening to what the community is saying, right? But if you're going to be participating in tournaments, there are codes of behavior that are expected of you. And so the idea is that it is an extension of common decency, right? It is treating other people with respect by creating content in such a fashion that it's inclusive.
Like I said, I like it. It's just that weird, twisted, freedom-loving part of me is just like rebelling against it, even though the other part of me is like, no, this is a good thing, let it happen.
Yeah, I would say again that freedom of action is not freedom from consequence, right? So establishing this as an expectation for inclusion, you can decide, hey, I'm not going to do this, and there's a consequence to that action, but it does not prevent you from taking that action, right? And we're not talking about like someone getting arrested or anything, right? This is just specifically for a community that is working towards an inclusive, a community that is inclusive, that this is an expectation.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so I think we're coming towards the end of the hour, but before then I was wondering, what goals do you have for your future in accessibility advocacy, and also what do you want the public to know about your disability in particular?
Give me 1 second to mute while this
thing goes through.
New York City, man.
Yeah, we are still in the middle of a pandemic in New York City, so there are occasional sirens. Honestly, I would encourage people not to focus on my disability in particular, but please talk to your community members about what access barriers they face. Like, I could talk to you about mine until I'm blue in the face, but you need to worry about your own community first. So don't ask me about mine. Ask your community about theirs and how to take steps to address them. for me, like my hopes for my future, I just want to keep learning. I want to keep learning and continuing to work toward an FGC where all of the content that's out there is out there for everyone. Um, uh, I've sort of mentioned this before, but I would love to get to the point where a lot of the work I'm doing is irrelevant. I would love to get to the point where all of the individual content creators and TOs are so on the ball about learning about all of the technology that's coming out and all the different ways to break down access barriers that there's nothing that there's no reason for me to teach it. That they're just, they get so passionate about it, about including folks like all of us, that they're hunting it out on their own. I would also love to see a reduction in the work that I do because people are listening to people that have been here since before I was there, before I joined the community, right? Again, mentioned before, lots of folks who have done lots of work and have not gotten the recognition that they deserve. I've managed to be in the right place at the right time on a few occasions, which, that's the luck of the draw. And there's definitely some portion of that unconscious biases are playing a role in why I'm being asked these questions and not other people. And so I would love to see these questions, not necessarily from you folks specifically, but at a community level, to go to the experts who have been here for much longer and can answer them more directly, because I'm not deaf and I'm not blind. And so I can say, like, yeah, this is, what I've heard from these people, but just go talk to them. Talk to the people that have the access barriers and work with them to break those down. Don't rely on a well-spoken intermediary to help get you there. Please make me irrelevant. That's what I would love. I would love to be in a position where I don't have to fight for any access barriers because they're all there. So I can tune into any stream, go to any tournament, play any game with any of my friends, and all of us have access. That's my hope for the future.
No, I think that's a great hope and a great perspective. And I love what you said earlier in the stream, how you're not someone who's necessarily changing everything. You're just another guy who's saying it, who has a little bit more of a following or something. You're another guy saying it, which that little quote right there spoke to me. It's like you don't have to be a game changer. You can just be another person, another voice, and I think that's a great thing to instill into anyone who's watching.
Right.
Yeah, you don't have to be disabled to be one of our allies. If you see a barrier that people have told you about and you just see it there, it's there, speak up about it, help us out, direct people to us, the ones facing the barrier, so that we can explain it more.
Right, exactly, because it's just like how I can't really fully test, like, for instance, if I wanted to test a game, I can't test a game for blindness because I don't have it. I mean, maybe there's a way to do that, but I'm just saying, like, directly, like, I'm talking in terms of, like, say I pick up a controller. I can tell if something can play with a controller, I know that works. And that's, like, kind of my disability, but you know what I mean?
At the end of the day, there is no replacement for lived experience.
Exactly.
You can approximate it and get some of the bigger things, but there's no replacement.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed.
I think that's so great final thoughts. A great way to wrap everything up here.
Absolutely.
Now, yeah, I appreciate you being on, Brian, and love learning about everything. It's obviously you're extremely well spoken and very passionate and a great advocate for all this. So it's been a pleasure learning about EDS and your perspective in general.
Yeah.
So thank you again for not even just being here, but for informing me more and giving me more of a reason to be involved.
My pleasure. Thank you, folks, for continuing to discuss these issues on your podcast, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here.
And
it was an honor.
Also, thanks, Patrick, for the compliment there on the great show. Thanks a lot. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Athea, or I guess Patrick. All right, guys. Well,
yep.
That's it for us. Remember, if you want to join our Discord, if you want to be a part of the conversation,
yep.
And remember, keep it wheel.
Alrighty, we'll see you next time.
Have a wonderful week.